Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 17 of the podcast series. Welcome to anyone who's just joining me for the first time. It's nice to have you here, and welcome back to those of you who have been with me for a number of episodes. It's hard to believe I'm not really a numbers person so much, but I was just looking on YouTube today and we are close to 700 subscribers. That is amazing to me, considering that I started this as a quiet little kind of podcasty journal thing up in my yarn room last fall. So thank you all so much for following along. I have some plans for some new spinning videos and some other things this summer as I have a little bit more time to put some videos together. So expect some more of those kinds of things in addition to the regular podcast. You can find me just about everywhere as Knitting the Stash, on Ravelry and Instagram, on YouTube obviously, and on the blog, which is knittingthestash.wordpress.com. The blog is where I post a lot of fun photos, finished objects, like kinds of philosophical thinkings about knitting, and different tips and tricks, for DIY or for hacking into knitting in certain kinds of ways. This is a podcast about knitting and spinning, and I suppose I focus mostly on the DIY stuff, but I also, in this podcast, am focusing on my kind of learning experience as a knitter and a spinner. And as I try out new techniques, I like to show them to you and talk about them and talk about my experiences, so that if you're going through similar kinds of learning processes, you might benefit from kind of this community that we're building of folks who are trying to learn new techniques and advance their skills in certain kinds of ways. So today in the podcast, I have a quick discussion about socks, because I've knit a lot of socks now. Suddenly I became a sock knitter somehow. Socks and sweaters. That's what you mostly find here. And I just noticed a couple things about some socks that I've been knitting up, and I thought I'd share with you a little comparison about the yarn and the sock styles and some blocking and things like that. So we're gonna have a sock discussion. Then a couple works in progress. My Ella Cardigan is coming along really nicely, and I'll talk about that for a little while. And I'm working on a test knit for Anna of the Dunkelgrund podcast. So I can share a little bit about that. I'm kind of excited to share that with you a little bit. And then I have a quick review of just a couple acquisitions, Laine Magazine and some fiber that I found at the farmer's market in New York, which was a really great experience. And we have some giveaways. So at the end, I've got a giveaway winner and a new giveaway, another sponsor for the blog and the podcast, and that is Moonstone Dye Works. So I'll stay tuned for that. Okay, so let's jump right into the sock knitting discussion. I've been knitting socks for a couple years now, and I was a kind of reluctant sock knitter. I knew that a lot of folks really love knitting socks, and I just kind of was like, well, it's a very practical garment. Maybe I'll learn, maybe I won't. And I just got hooked once I made my first socks. And I really like giving them away. I love giving them as gifts. So my husband received a couple of the first pairs of socks. My son's gotten a pair, my dad, my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, I hand them out like candy, basically, at this point. And so I feel like I've had a lot of experience with different kinds of yarns and different kinds of patterns. I often use Susan B. Anderson's How I Make My Socks basic pattern. That's where I started. It was the first kind of vanilla sock pattern that I used. And a lot of my socks at this point, no matter what pattern I'm using, will often riff on that pattern. And it's kind of a nice basic pattern for a number of stitches to cast on, how to do a heel flap and gusset, all of those kinds of things. That's kind of the sock that I really like. So I tend to make that sock. And you guys know if you were listening to the podcast from a couple weeks back, I just finished some socks that were based on a kind of Gansey recipe from General Hogbuffer, and I used some beautiful Knitting in France yarn for that, which was a merino nylon blend. Those socks have not been worn yet, so I'll have to report back to you on how the wear goes. But one thing I did notice in knitting those socks is that I knit at a looser gauge and with bigger needles. The knitting process itself was much more enjoyable for me. My hands were less cramped up as I was knitting. And I'm really curious to see how they wear, so I'll have to report back on that. But I was also knitting a pair of socks for my mother-in-law that you guys know about, and they are finished. So these are the Mother-in-Law Socks for Marie. And Marie picked out the yarn for this. And I think it was I've talked about these on here before. This is the Fiber Nymph Dyeworks sock yarn, which is a 80-20 merino nylon blend. Is it going? Will it show up? Come on. It wants to, but it just can't do it today. So this is a 80-20 merino blend in the colorway Bloodlust. And I worked these up in a pattern that I've worked before. This is my tried and true twisted stitch pattern that I use for, especially for knee socks. I thought I'd try it on a pair of calf length socks just to see how it comes out. And basically I do a twisted ribs 2x2, no, twisted rib 1x1, no, 2x2. Oh my gosh, I'm really just having one of those days. It's a 2x2 twisted rib all the way around the cuff, and then I continue it down the front of the foot, right? This style seems to hold up a little bit better up on the leg. If you're going higher on the leg, it really kind of squeezes the leg nicely. But as I was knitting these socks, I had some thoughts about sock knitting. And the first thought I had is that these socks, I was worried they were going to be a little bit small. And so I washed and blocked the first sock before I began the second sock to try it on and see. And I just wanted to show you the difference between a blocked sock and a not blocked sock, and I think you'll be able to see. So this is the not blocked sock in the front, and you can see how kind of shriveled up it is down the foot. You know, it just looks kind of tiny, and the actual, you can see here, even just the width. I've got the ends lined up over here. The width of the sock, there's about an inch difference there. So the entire sock, because of this twisted rib stitch, is kind of shrunken looking. And this is how it comes out after it's been blocked. And so I was reminded that if you have certain kinds of yarn or certain kinds of, and this yarn in particular feels very stiff to me as I was working with it, and then it's softened right up after I washed it. So the blocking rule is still true. I've talked about this before on here with shawls. And Anna Knitter of the Anna Knitter podcast has talked about blocking with shawls. I'm talking about blocking with socks. Really important because it'll give you a more accurate gauge on how your sizing is going. The other thing I did with these socks as I was thinking about socks is I cast on with a larger needle, just I think 1/4 millimeter bigger. So instead of 2.5, or let's see, I'm using size 1s, which is a US size 1, which is a 2.25. I cast on with a 2.5, and I worked a couple rows with the larger needles just to give it a little bit more of a give at that top when you pull it on over your ankle and you want it to really come up easily. So this sock has a little bit more give in the top. So I was thinking about sock knitting and thinking about them in terms of gauge and blocking and getting the right kind of fit for feet, especially the feet that aren't mine. Luckily, Marie's feet are about the same size as mine, so I could use my feet to test these out. And I think they came out really well. So I'm going to block that second sock and hand them off to her with a bow very soon. But it also made me think about washing socks, because as I washed those socks, I decided to throw in my knee socks. And you guys have seen these before. This is the similar pattern. With the twisted rib, I did the twisted rib in the cuff, a long 4-inch cuff. And then I continued the twisted rib down the top and down the back and across the top of the foot, so that as a knee sock it would actually stand up pretty well. So I threw these actually ended up throwing these in the washer. This is all superwash yarn. And I don't like to hand wash socks. It's the one garment that it feels kind of gross to me to hand wash it for whatever reason. And I'm sure there are folks out there who hand wash their socks, and more power to you. I'm more of if I'm gonna wear socks, I want to throw them in the washer. Not the dryer, but the washer. So these were thrown in the washing machine. And what surprised me most about this yarn, and this is a cornbread and honey yarn. This is an independent dyer, and I only had 2 skeins of her yarn to try out. So this, I had a big plan to make knee socks from them. And I think this was called Sunset on the Lake or something like that. Look what happened. And I think you'll be able to see it. So you get all of this fuzzing and it just feels kind of worn out. Now, I wore these socks, I think, twice before I washed them. And I was just really, and I think you can see all of that fuzz. Sure, I could shave this off, you know, no problem. And they're definitely soft, you know, that's fine. But you can see this, I think, all of this fuzz, right? And it lost its kind of luster. The yarn is it was a beautiful colorway to begin with. And I think you can see the colorway better up here at the top, obviously where there's less wear going on. But this foot part just kind of distressed me. And I thought, gosh, you know, maybe that's why it really matters what kind of yarn base you have, and it does matter how you treat your socks. I still want to be able to throw my socks in the washing machine. And so then I started thinking about other socks I've made. And when I first made socks, I went with the Regia, Arnie, and Carlos self-striping yarns because I really just love the way they look. And these were some of the first socks I knit for my husband, and his feet are very big, so they don't quite fit on this form right. But these are the Regia Arnie and Carlos socks, and he has worn these to death. He wears them like when he's doing construction work, he wears them around the house in the winter, but you know, in stocking feet, just around the house. And look how well they've held up, right? I mean, you can see the bottoms of these are just fine. The color and everything is still looking sharp. And really beautiful. So this is a Regia yarn, and it's a hard wearing yarn. When you're knitting with this yarn, it's definitely it's not as soft. I believe it's a 4-ply yarn, but the wear on these is incredible. And I know I was reading another blog. Gosh, I can't think of her name right now. I read it every time it comes out. But she's knit up a bunch of socks with the Regia Arnie and Carlos, and she's had her socks for like a decade, and they're still going strong. She's never had to patch them in any kind of way. And this is a merino nylon blend, but you know, when you hold the yarn in your hand initially before you knit with it and wash it, it's a very hard feeling yarn, but it produces these socks that will go forever, right? You know, this is like, I've worn it twice and washed it once, and it's like super fuzz factory, and I just worry that it looks like it's just gonna wear out, and it just doesn't look good anymore. You know, to spend this much time on a knee sock and then have it kind of like, that's sad. I don't like that so much. Whereas these socks are pretty amazing. So it really comes down to, I think, sock yarn construction. Like the base yarn that you're using matters a lot. And for socks, just like other certain kinds of outerwear, you want to have something that's going to be hard wearing, even if it feels a little stiff on your feet. Now, my husband, I will say, my husband, when it comes to these socks, asked me to knit a pair of more like merino soft type socks. And I did knit him a pair of those, and he wears them, and he likes them, and those have been pretty hard wearing too. His complaint about these socks was just that as he actually, when he would walk on them, he could almost feel the stitches on the bottoms of his feet. You know, they are definitely hard wearing. Not only on the yarn, but the yarn feels a little different on your feet. And I don't blame him for that. I mean, wearing these is a totally different experience than even just putting on the Knitting in France socks, where the base yarn is just glorious and really soft and plump. So it depends on your base yarn. Now, I found a really great blog that's called Just Knit Better Socks, and it's by Rena Meyer Dries. I think that's her last name, Drees. And she keeps her blog pretty well updated. I'd highly recommend it. And she talks all about sock yarns. What's the best sock yarns and sock fibers? Like, what are the best ones? She has a bunch of reviews out, and she really is thinking a lot about this issue of the sock. And I found on her blog, she has this terrific table, and I'll post a link in the show notes. Let's see if we can get this to focus here a little bit. There you go. So she has this terrific chart up of tons of different sock yarns that she's reviewed. And although you can't see it super well on the screen, I'll put a link in and you can check it out. Let me get the camera back. And she reviews not only the Regia 4-ply, but like the Madeline Tosh, and a bunch of other Knit Pick Stroll, Schaefer yarns, which I've used but not for socks, Malabrigo sock, Let's see, Lang, Woollen Rabbit, the Zoberball, like all of those, some of the big major sock yarn companies. She reviews them and gives you a sense of how they wash, how they dry, what kind of wear she's getting out of them. So totally an excellent resource. That's the Knit Better Socks at blogspot.com, and I'll post a link to her in the show notes. So I'm thinking a lot more about what kinds of yarn I want to use when I knit socks, because I do want them to be the kind of thing that that lasts for the person who wears them, but also feels comfortable on the foot. And I think that's a really fine line. And for anyone out there who has some good advice about sock yarns or other resources, I'd really love to try to collect those things. I'm thinking of opening up a thread in the Ravelry group to have us start a conversation about socks and sock yarns, and trying to walk that fine line between soft comfort and like hard wearing. And maybe we can develop a good resource together about what socks we've knit up, what patterns we've used, and what sock yarns we've used, and how they're wearing and what we think of them. So I'll open up that thread in the Ravelry group and we can continue this discussion, I hope. Okay, so that's my sock yarn discussion. Next up, whips this week. Ella is coming along. This is the Woodhouse Knits, Jennifer Wood of Woodhouse Knits, Ella Cardigan, and I showed it on last week's episode. And last time you saw it, it was kind of like rodeo style. It was, right about here, and it is extended and expanded since then. I'm actually now down to the ribbing that will finish this off on the bottom, and I'm going to bring her forward here so that hopefully you can see it a little bit better. Looks like I might need to raise her up. Okay. So I've brought Ella forward here and raised her up a little bit so that you can see better what's going on. And I talked a lot about it last week, so I'm just going to give you a quick update here. This has been a slow knit. As I said, I get about an inch done. We were in the car traveling to New York, so I had some good hours in the back seat with my charts and my cable needle, et cetera, et cetera. So I did get much farther, almost done with the body. I've got about an inch of ribbing left to go. This is a fairly short sweater compared to, say, the Alias sweaters that I was knitting, which sit much lower on your hip. This sweater is intended to kind of sit higher on your hip, like you'd wear it with a sundress, or something else, maybe some other kind of fancy blouses or something that where it would be okay to have a higher kind of sweater. So measurement-wise, this distance between the underarm and the beginning of the ribbing is only about 11 inches. So the total sweater will be about 13 inches rather than 14 or 15, which is where I generally tend to go. You can see the back panel, which is probably the most impressive part of this sweater. And it's come out pretty well. I'm most impressed with the ways that Jennifer has worked the pattern down into the ribbing, so that the ribbing is not just simply a 1x1 knit purl ribbing, but it maintains a lot of the cables, especially these smaller 2x2 cables. And actually, the Fruity Knitting podcast talked about these cables, and I think it was just maybe 2 episodes ago, and she showed a bunch of different patterns that had used these kind of small 2x2 cables that you can do without a cable needle very easily. And Jennifer Wood makes good use of those cables throughout the sweater, but they continue down into the ribbing, so that my husband called it, he said it's like the Matrix effect, which I thought was a perfect way to describe this sweater. So all of this really wild like information and lace and cable and stuff kind of falls down into the ribbing, and just a few lines of code kind of continue down into the ribbing. So you'll see the side thing, the side detail continues down into the ribbing here. And on the front, you can really see that a bunch of the cables, these 3 cables here continue down to the front, and then this cable here. So it's I like the idea of a matrix effect for the sweater. In the front, one of the great things about this pattern is that you're working the button bands at the same time that you're working the sweater. And this side is where your buttons are going to go. And it has a natural twisted stitch built into the pattern so that it will be tucked under and hemmed like that. so that it's a really beautiful button band, nice and sturdy for putting your buttons on. And your buttonholes are also being worked at the same time. And they are worked as this kind of faux cable, which you might recognize as being part, or very similar to the Ella Cardigan. There was a faux kind of cable that leaves, it's worked with these yarn overs that allow you to put, you could put a button through that and use it as a buttonhole. And because of the way this is designed, you can choose how many buttons you want to include, because you have a buttonhole nearly every inch here, so you can decide how many buttons you want to have on the button band, and then that's your button setup. I love the fact that this is all worked into the sweater so that at the end, when I come back, I don't have to work the button band in addition to the collar and the sleeves. All that's left here is an inch of ribbing, and then the sleeves, which will be, I think, compared to the rest of the sweater, the sleeves will be very, I call this a simple cable pattern compared to the rest of the sweater. This kind of cable pattern continued down. She has 3/4 length sleeves, or even a little bit shorter than 3/4 length. I think I'm going to go full length, but I have not fully committed to that yet. I'll have to see. I have enough yarn either way. And then the final touch will be a neckline, a collar that is literally, I think, 2 rows of knitting around, like a row of knitting and a row of purling, and then a bind off. So that, you know, by the end of the sweater, things start to go pretty quickly. One thing that's strange about these kinds of sweaters to me, especially one such as this with all of the lace, is that as I'm knitting, and finishing, and the lace is kind of dropping out, and the cables are dropping out, and you're getting this matrix effect. I feel a little bit sad about the loss of the lace and the cables. Like, maybe some of you feel this way too. You get into a pattern like this, and it takes you a few inches to really kind of learn the kind of groove of the pattern, and where the lace kind of sits and how it works, and the cables, and you know that you've got this patch of stockinette before the twisted stitch down the side, and then you get to the front panel, and you kind of like really learn this pattern. You get into the groove. It's kind of like driving down a highway or something. And then, you know, you get off the highway and you have to do 30 miles an hour again, and you're just kind of like, whoa, everything's kind of distorted. You feel a little bit like your brain has learned all of this lace, and you're maybe never going to go back to this particular pattern ever again. You know, I'm not going to remake this sweater. I've remade a lot of sweaters, but probably not this sweater. And so it feels a little bit like the wind up and the learning, and then the pitch, and then that's it. It's over. There's no second pitch. So I'm feeling a little nostalgic for the lace at this point, even though as I was knitting it, I was kind of like, wow, this is a lot of lace and cables. So that's okay. It's, you know, it's a learning process. I've learned so much from this sweater about top-down construction, about lace and cables, about including these really subtle details about button bands and turned hems, and I love all of those little features of this sweater. And I'm sad to see the lace and cables be kind of wrapping up, but it's been an excellent sweater to knit, and I have in mind another of her sweaters for my next one in a worsted weight, not a kind of fingering weight yarn. So give my fingers a little bit of relief. Yeah, so that's Ella. It's coming along nicely. I hope by next time I'll be wearing it so that you can see what it actually looks like. I have another car trip in my future, and I'm thinking the sleeves will happen at that point. So there you have it. Okay, so the other work in progress that is about to get started is Anna of the Dunkelgrund podcast, and hopefully you guys have checked out her podcast because it's really cool. She is originally from Austria, and she's podcasting from Zurich in Switzerland, where she just finished her PhD in chemistry, so she often will feature short segments about the chemistry of wool and fiber, which is really informative and awesome to hear, you know, like from a committed knitter and a chemist to kind of learn about that, how fiber is working. And so I really enjoy her podcast. She has a great Ravelry group going, and I'll put links to all of this in the show notes. And so check out the Dunkelgrund podcast. But she is doing, I saw in one of her recent episodes, she was looking for test knitters for one of her new pairs of socks. And so I volunteered, and that is what I'm working on. So and I can show you this because she's released this on social media, and it's all cool. These are her new socks, the new sock patterns. Oops. And that's my shawls. There's so many knitting pictures on here. Okay, let's get back to the socks. Okay, so this is the Dunkelgrün socks, the new ones. And when I saw them, I immediately thought those are really cool because they have cables and a little bit of color, but not total color work, just a little bit on the heel. And so I said, can I test knit, please? And so I think there are 10 or 12 of us at this point who are test knitting. And I've selected my yarns. I thought I'd show you those. So her socks, she has a kind of tweedy main color, that beautiful reddish kind of burnt orange for the toe. And then she uses a third color for that, that contrasting heel that I think you can see right there, where there are 3 colors going on the heel. So I decided to invert things a little bit because I decided to go stash diving for this particular project. So my main color is going to be this beautiful purple, and this is from Eden Cottage Yarns. I picked up when I was in England, Scotland, the UK, on one of these business ventures. When I go give lectures, I try to take an afternoon and go to the yarn shops. So this is a BFL sock, and the colorway is Salvia, and BFL being blue-faced Leicester. And it's definitely a different kind of yarn. It's very thin, but it's got a little tweedy thing going on, so I thought it would be cool for the main color. And next to that, for the toes and the top and some of the contrast, I'm going to use the some remaining yarn that I have left over from the Knitting in France socks, which I love. And it's a really lovely, plump, beautiful kind of pinky color, and they'll go together well. And then the third, since she used blue for her third color and I'm going darker, I decided to use a light color for my third. And so there it is. And this yarn comes from the mini skein set from The Walking Dead by LB Art Yarns. And it's an awesome little set of yarns. I love them. I think one of the colorways, this one might be Carol, I'm trying to remember. But one of them is like, if Glenn dies, we riot, which is just hilarious. There's Walker on the Windshield, there's Herschel's farm, there's one for Daryl, there's one for Maggie, like all the different great characters in The Walking Dead. So if you're into The Walking Dead, regardless of how this last season has played out, it's a cool mini yarn skein set. So these are the 3 colors that I'm going to use for my sock, for my Dunkelgrün sock test knit. And I am really looking forward to trying it out. I went to a guild meetup with some of my gals yesterday, and I brought my mother-in-law Marie, who's in town, with me, and we were all talking so much as I was trying to cast on that it was like a failed cast on. So I'm going to start over with that. Those are going to be the colors, and I think it's going to turn out pretty cool. I'm really curious to see how that BFL turns out, in part because it was a skein of yarn that I bought when I was overseas, like I said, and I've been saving for a long time, but in part because it feels a little bit scratchy. And I haven't knit socks out of BFL yet, but BFL is supposed to be an excellent sock yarn. It's supposed to be hard wearing, it's a long wool, longer wool, and so I'll be curious to see how the main body of the sock works out with this particular breed of yarn. And it is 100% BFL, there's no nylon mixed into this one. So I will report back, hopefully in our Ravelry sock yarn group, so that we can all learn about good sock yarns out there. Yeah, so those are my 2 whips. And the last couple things I have are just 2 quick acquisitions and then giveaways. So acquisition number 1 is the latest issue of Laine Magazine. If you guys haven't checked this out yet, even if it just means going to your local yarn store and kind of just flipping through the pages, it's a really beautiful magazine. I love it because of the photography, the white space, the kind of way that everything's laid out. There's just there's a great sense of design to this magazine, and I find it to just be fun because there are lots of good interviews. This one's with Andrea Mowry, who's been doing the Find Your Fade shawl and the the new sweater, and I'm totally blanking on the name of it. It's like a faded sweater, maybe. And I love the patterns in here. The yarns are just beautiful. The patterns are kind of classic. And then there's little bits and pieces in here about place. So there's an article about Helsinki in here. And there's some really terrific, there's an interview with Felicia Lowe. And this is issue number 2 of the Laine Magazine. I picked up the first one, I think after Sarah of Fiber Trek recommended it. I checked it out and I just fell in love. And the patterns are laid out suchly. So they're really nice and simple, and they take up the kind of back of the book. And I really think it's a beautiful magazine. Even if you're just interested in kind of flipping through it, it is more of a pattern book. So it really is. This one's chock full of sweater patterns and a pair of socks and a shawl or two. And some really beautiful, just kind of classy design. So check it out. The other fun thing I did last week is we were in New York and we went to the farmer's market, because we always go to the farmer's market, and we go by canoe when we go because my husband doesn't like to drive through all the traffic, and I don't blame him. I think a farmer's market can be a little bit not fun if you go by car. But we go in, we put the canoe in at Cass Park, which is right across the canal from the farmer's market. And we paddle over and tie up at the dock and go get some food. There's my favorite food there is they have this delicious Cambodian food. I go get the tofu kind of lemongrass curry over there. It's delicious. And we like to check out the little market stands. I thought I had seen everything there because it's typically the same folks over and over again, and especially the fiber folks. There's one farm there that shows up quite often that raises Wensleydales, and I've checked them out, I've talked to them, checked out their yarn. But this was a new to me farm, and they were actually selling a bunch of veggies and things, but they were also selling some roving, and it turns out I talked to the young lady who was running the booth, and they have a flock of Jacob sheep. I think she said they have about 8 ewes right now and 4 lambs on their little farm, and this is the Forget-Me-Not farm. So we'll see if we can get this to focus in. So this was the beautiful tag for their roving, Jacob roving. And so I have 4 ounces of Jacob roving here in this beautiful gray color. They had brown, they had a kind of white, light gray, and then this gray, and I just couldn't resist this. I haven't spun Jacob before, not in a kind of natural way like this, and I really love, I love, you guys know this, going and talking to the farmers who've raised the sheep and then picking up some roving and spinning it up just to see what it's like for a breed specific kind of study of what it would be like to spin up Jacob. And this just seems particularly cool to me. So here's a little shout out to the Forget-Me-Not farm and their awesome Jacob fleece, which as I spin it up, I will let you know how it goes. But it's a kind of good reminder to check out those little places along the way, the farmers markets and the farms and the stands and any little shops and local yarn stores for the kind of local folks who are raising sheep and fiber, and you can get your fiber that way. As Sarah of Fiber Truck would say, in a kind of soulful stash way. It's nice to know where things are coming from and to meet the people who are involved and the sheep involved. So that's always fun for me. Okay, so that is acquisitions, and now for the giveaways. So we've got our giveaways as the last little bit of this segment here, and if you'll recall from last week, I had this beautiful sample pack of 3 different kinds of wool, some Targhee, some BFL, and a Targhee Cross, plus some unicorn scour to give away. And this is from Cami Noyes of Ranching Tradition Fiber. Thank you so much for sponsoring the last podcast, Cami. Awesome. And it generated such great discussion as usual about how folks wash their raw fleece, and it's always so much fun to read and to see what's going on. So thank you all for participating and offering your advice and enthusiasm for washing raw fleece. The winner of this, we had 36 entries for the giveaway, and the winner was Rachel of the Treehouse Knits podcast. Hey Rachel, what's up? Rachel has been doing a really interesting series of podcasts where she features a particular breed of sheep, and she does some research, she reads out of the Fleece and Fiber source book, she provides a lot of information about each of the breeds. So when I saw that she had won this, I thought, gosh, it really couldn't be any more perfect. So Rachel, I've sent you a little note on YouTube. If you can get back in touch with me at knittingthestash@gmail.com, we can get this popped in the mail to you, and you can check out some of Ranching Tradition Fiber's awesome Targhee and BFL and Bond Cross. You're gonna love it, and I can't wait to hear about it more, maybe on your podcast. Awesome. Okay, so one giveaway down, and then there's another giveaway to go. So for those of you who checked out the blog last Saturday, you saw a great interview with Tommy Trujillo of Squirrel Pie Productions podcast. And Tommy is also a brilliant indie dyer. She has a great shop on Etsy called Moonstone Dye Works. And here are a couple of her beautiful skeins of yarn and kind of purples and reds and pinks and whites and grays. And Tommy was kind enough to send along some of her yarn for me to check out, and because she sent 2 skeins, there's one for me to make something with and one for one of you guys to win. So how we're gonna do this is nice and simple. We're gonna leave a comment here on the YouTube, this particular episode on YouTube. Check out her shop. Tell me what colorways you love, right? Which ones are the ones that are awesome, you know? Which ones do you want to knit with? And you can include these 2 colorways in your deliberations. This one's called Floating, beautiful. And this one's called Lady Soul, a little darker, deeper purples, right? So you can enter by leaving a comment here on this episode of the podcast. Both simple to enter, and you'll have some fun checking out her shop and her beautiful colorways. So Tommy Trujillo, Moonstone Dye Works, giveaway. Awesome. Thank you, Tommy, so much. So I think that's it for the week. Thank you so much for stopping by, and thanks to all the folks who have sponsored this podcast, Ranching Tradition Fibers, Tommy Trujillo of Moonstone Dye Works, and to all of you out there who are knitting and spinning and having some fun. Enjoy it. It's the summertime. This is great, beautiful weather. Be outside, knit in public, share with your friends, have some fun, and I will see you soon. Thanks for coming by. Take care.